There is a specific kind of person who has never left the town they were born in, not because they couldn't, but because leaving never actually occurred to them as a live option. No one forbade it. The roads out existed, the buses ran on schedule. Nothing physical held them there. What held them was smaller and stranger, an entire life built on the quiet assumption that this was simply what a life was. Everyone has some version of that town, not a place, a structure, a way the world got explained to you early enough and consistently enough that by the time you were old enough to question it, there was nothing left that felt like a question. It stopped looking like a belief you had absorbed. It started looking like the ceiling of what was real. Ask that person what's beyond the edge of their world and they won't refuse to answer. They'll look at you like the question doesn't quite pass, the way you might look at someone who asked, "What's north of the North Pole?" Not defensive. Genuinely unable to locate the question inside anything they've ever had to think about. This isn't a story about ignorance in the ordinary sense. An ignorant person usually knows they're missing something, a fact, a skill, a piece of information they could go find if they wanted it badly enough. This is stranger. It's a kind of not knowing that feels from the inside exactly like knowing everything that matters. A closed system that doesn't feel closed. A surface with no visible seam because the seam was built into the way you learned to read it in the first place before you had any way of noticing the construction taking place. There's an old idea for exactly this condition. Long before psychology had language for it, a scattering of ancient thinkers grouped today under a single modern label, Gnosticism, though they never called themselves one unified movement and disagreed with each other constantly, kept circling the same suspicion. The trouble with most people isn't what they don't know, it's that they've forgotten they don't know it. Ignorance, in that view, wasn't a gap waiting to be filled. It was a condition mistaken for the whole of existence. Start with something almost too obvious to notice, how anything gets learned in the first place. A child doesn't experience rules as rules, it experiences them as the texture of the world. Don't interrupt, don't ask too many questions at dinner. Success looks like this. Love is earned like that. None of it arrives labeled one possible interpretation, subject to revision. It arrives labeled nothing at all because it arrives before a person is really equipped to label anything as one option among others. By the time a person can step back and evaluate what they were taught, most of it has already stopped being a lesson and started being the grammar they think in. This is the first and most ordinary form of forgetting, and there is nothing supernatural about it. Every framework a person absorbs early enough eventually loses its status as a framework. It doesn't get erased, it gets promoted quietly, without ceremony, from a way of seeing to the way things are. You can watch this happen in real time with anyone who has changed industries, moved to another country, or fallen out of a subculture they once lived inside completely. Someone raised inside a family where disagreement was treated as disloyalty will spend years in other settings, a workplace, a friendship, a marriage, quietly amazed and slightly offended that other people argue, and then simply move on as though nothing happened. It never occurs to them that disagreement equals danger was an equation, not a law of nature. What used to feel like the obvious order of things reveals itself retroactively as a set of local customs that felt total only because there was nothing nearby to compare them against. There's a reason familiarity can do this, and it has little to do with whether the thing being learned is actually true. The mind doesn't always cleanly separate "I have encountered this constantly" from every direction for as long as I can remember. From "this is simply how reality works." Those two sensations can arrive close enough together, carrying enough of the same conviction that repetition alone, with no argument attached to it at all, can start to feel like something closer to verification. This is one reason a person can hold a belief with real certainty and, if asked to defend it, find they have surprisingly little on hand, mostly the accumulated weight of never having heard it questioned. Familiarity isn't evidence. It can simply feel like evidence, and feeling like evidence is sometimes enough to end the inquiry before it starts. The second piece is harder to see because it doesn't feel like a limitation. It feels like coherence. A worldview doesn't need to explain everything correctly in order to feel complete. It only needs to define in advance what counts as a real question. This is the quiet trick underneath most closed systems, religious or secular, ancient or contemporary. They don't run out of answers because they've already decided what's allowed to count as a problem. Anything outside that boundary doesn't register as unexplained. It doesn't register at all. Inside certain workplaces, for instance, burnout can stop being a question the culture is equipped to ask. It gets quietly translated into a question about the individual's resilience, so the system rarely has to account for itself, and the person inside it can experience that translation as simply describing reality rather than producing it. The same thing happens at a larger scale inside entire political or national cultures, where a grievance that would be unremarkable to describe from outside is, from inside, not suppressed so much as unthinkable, not because anyone is actively silencing it, but because the culture's working vocabulary was never built to hold it. A structure like this can feel airtight for an entire lifetime, not because it has actually accounted for reality, but because it has quietly pre-selected which parts of reality get to ask for an account. This is closer to what those ancient thinkers meant by ignorance than the modern sense of the word suggests. Across the range of traditions later filed under Gnosticism, communities and texts associated with Alexandria, the Nile Valley, and pockets of the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world developing in uneven contact with early Christianity, Judaism, and Greek philosophy, the details differed sharply from group to group, and it would be inaccurate to describe them as a single coherent religion with one creed, one scripture, or one origin story. Some describe the visible, material world as the work of a lesser, blind, or mistaken craftsman power, often called a demiurge, administered through subordinate forces sometimes called archons. Others framed the same suspicion in less mythic, more contemplative terms, without the same elaborate cosmic architecture at all. What runs underneath the variation isn't a shared cosmology, and it would overstate the record to call it a single shared thesis either. But a number of the texts and traditions most often grouped under this label return in different ways to a related concern, that ordinary human experience involves a kind of ignorance, forgetting, or non-recognition, and that this condition is itself easy to overlook. Not a missing fact. A missing awareness that anything is missing. Several of these traditions described something like a spark of another order buried inside the ordinary person, hidden beneath layers of an ordinary, convincing world, not as a scientific claim this video is making, but as the psychological shape of the idea worth borrowing, that whatever is most attentive in a person can still be present and functionally invisible, buried under a reality so convincingly total that no one thinks to ask what convinced them of its totality in the first place. None of this needs to be taken as literal cosmology to be useful, and it shouldn't be. Whatever historically precise reading belongs to any specific ancient text or community is a question for religious history, not for this video, and scholars themselves continue to disagree about many of the details, including how unified or fragmented these movements actually were. What is worth borrowing is narrower and far more defensible, the recognition that a person can be fully informed and still fail to recognize the structure doing the informing, which brings up the distinction the entire idea turns on. Information is not gnosis. You can know, as a fact, that your upbringing shaped your assumptions. Plenty of people know that sentence the way they know a state capital correctly and almost entirely uselessly. It sits in the same part of the mind as trivia. It changes nothing about how they actually get through a day, argue with a partner, or decide what's realistic and what isn't, because knowing a fact about your own conditioning and recognizing that conditioning while it's actively operating are two different acts, performed by two different parts of a person. Someone can read an entire book about how fear of abandonment distorts a person's read of ordinary silence, nod along, recommend it to a friend, and still, 2 weeks later, spiral for an hour because a text went unanswered for 40 minutes, with the book's entire argument sitting inert somewhere behind them, fully known and entirely unused in the one moment it might have mattered. A person can even explain the mechanism perfectly to someone else, mid-spiral, and keep spiraling anyway, because explaining a pattern and stepping outside of it while it's running are two different skills that happen to share the same vocabulary. Historically, Gnosis carried religious and soteriological meanings that varied considerably between traditions, and this video isn't claiming to settle what any specific community meant by it. For the psychological reading this video is interested in, the useful distinction is narrower, not gnosis as salvation, but the difference between possessing information and recognizing the structure through which that information gets interpreted, the difference between being told there is a boundary around the picture and actually noticing for one disorienting second that you have been looking through one the entire time. The modern version of this doesn't require a demiurge. It runs through more familiar architecture, identity, institution, language, routine, and consensus, each doing the same quiet job in ordinary life. An identity tells you in advance which experiences count as like you, and which get filed away as exceptions too small to revise the story you tell about yourself. An institution, a company, a family system, a professional field rewards certain interpretations so consistently and for so long that they stop feeling rewarded and start feeling simply correct, the way water can stop feeling wet to something that has rarely been dry. Language hands you categories before you have any say in the matter, and it can be genuinely difficult to notice a thought you don't yet have the words to have. A feeling can go unrecognized for years for lack of a term that would have let a person point at it. Routine can convert 1,000 small decisions into no decisions at all until years pass without a single one of a life's structuring choices being reconsidered from the outside, and consensus, the simple, powerful fact that everyone around you seems to be operating on the same unstated premises, can function as a kind of evidence, even when it isn't, because a claim repeated by everyone you know can eventually stop sounding like a claim at all and start sounding like weather. None of these 5 forces is conspiring against anyone. No one designed them to keep a person contained. They do their work automatically, as a side effect of how a mind stabilizes enough to function at all. A mind that questioned its entire interpretive structure at every turn would struggle to get much of anything done. The forgetting isn't necessarily a flaw in the system, it's closer to part of the price of having a system in the first place, which is what makes the moment of recognition so difficult to describe honestly without inflating it into something it isn't. It is not an opening onto a hidden layer of the universe. It is not a secret being handed over by someone who knew it all along. Most people who describe it afterward reach for the same modest, almost disappointing language, something closer to noticing without much fanfare, that what you had always mistaken for the territory itself was only ever a map of it, and a partial map at that. A person who leaves a rigid professional culture after a decade and finds themselves oddly disoriented by how differently competence gets recognized somewhere else isn't discovering a new truth about competence. They're discovering that their old definition of it had a shape, and shapes have edges. Something they had always assumed was simply how things are turns out to have been one interpretation among several, and the strange part isn't discovering what lay beyond it. The strange part is realizing there had been a boundary there the whole time, one they had been living inside without once suspecting it had edges at all. Nothing hidden gets revealed in that moment. What gets revealed is that something was never as total as it felt. It rarely arrives as a single cinematic instant either, whatever the mythic language suggests. More often it shows up as a small, almost forgettable snag, a sentence someone says in passing that doesn't fit the picture, a rule that suddenly sounds arbitrary when said out loud to a stranger, a version of yourself glimpsed for a second in an environment where none of the old assumptions applied and behaved fine anyway. The snag doesn't feel like a revelation, it feels like a minor inconsistency, easy to explain away, easy to forget by the following week. Most of them get forgotten. The ones that don't are the ones a person keeps circling back to, uninvited, until the structure they were part of stops being invisible. This is also exactly where the idea turns dangerous, and any honest treatment of it has to say so plainly, because the danger is not a footnote here, it is the second half of the thesis, not an afterthought to it. The moment someone believes they have seen through the frame that still has everyone else fooled, a new and much older trap opens beneath them. Call the first version of it epistemic superiority, the quiet, flattering certainty that everyone still operating inside the old structure is asleep, and that they, specifically, have woken up. It rarely announces itself as arrogance. It arrives dressed as compassion for the unenlightened, which makes it far more comfortable to keep than ordinary arrogance would be, and far harder to catch in yourself. From there, it's a short step to paranoia, where every disagreement stops looking like a difference of perspective and starts looking like proof that the system is working exactly as designed. This is the shape of a genuinely closed loop. It has no exit built into its own logic, because contrary evidence doesn't weaken it, it confirms it. Someone who has just recognized one boundary is especially vulnerable to this, precisely because the discovery felt so real, so hard-won, that anything questioning it can only look like more of the same sleep. Add contempt for the unenlightened, and the very insight that was supposed to loosen one rigid frame gets used instead to construct another, often crueler one, carrying the extra confidence of feeling earned rather than simply inherited. And add withdrawal, stepping away instead of questioning it, retreating into private certainty instead of staying in contact with people who see it differently, and lucidity curdles quietly into escape, which solves nothing because a frame abandoned rather than examined tends to get rebuilt, unnoticed, in whatever comes next, just as enclosing as the one it replaced. So what does a person actually do with this, if not chase a final unveiling, and not weaponize the first partial one they get? The honest answer is less satisfying than either option, and probably more useful than both. Recognizing that an interpretation is only an interpretation doesn't tell you what's outside it. It doesn't hand you the true structure to replace the false one, because the instant you reach for a replacement total system, a new philosophy, a new community, a new explanation that finally accounts for everything, you have already started constructing another closed surface with no visible seam, only this time built out of your own certainty instead of someone else's. The actual discipline, if it can be called that, is staying in the discomfort of partial sight without resolving it prematurely into either smug certainty or despair. Not "I have seen the truth." Something closer to "I can now notice that I am seeing through something, and I do not fully know what it's leaving out." That sentence will never trend on a thumbnail. It also happens to be the only version of this that doesn't quietly collapse back into exactly the condition it claims to have escaped, which leaves a different question than the one this usually gets reduced to. Not, what is the hidden reality behind the one I've been given? That question, however seductive, tends to manufacture its own answer and mistake the manufacturing for a discovery. The more durable question is quieter, and it doesn't resolve into a tidy answer or a new identity to build around. What has my current way of seeing made impossible for me to notice? Not because someone is hiding it from you, because completeness, most of the time, isn't the reward for having found everything. It's the symptom of having stopped looking for what your own structure was built from the very beginning to exclude. That's the part worth sitting with longer than feels comfortable. The world does not have to lie to you. A partial reality can feel complete whenever the edge of what you can see is mistaken for the edge of what is there,